What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality? Spirituality. Spirituality. How do they divert? How do they divert? How do they convert? How do they convert? How are we different? How are we different? How are we different? How are we the same? How are we the same? How are we the same? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality? Spirituality. Hi, this is Angelo John Lewis with the Diversity and Spirituality Network, and I'm here talking with Cindy Franklin, who is a co-founder of the Diversity and Spirituality Network. Cindy is currently an executive coach, consultant, and facilitator based in the Bay Area. Her work and perspective is informed by the years she spent living in India and studying with a renowned Indian meditation master. And I will say turnabout is fair play because a couple of weeks ago, Cindy interviewed me. So now I'm interviewing her. Cindy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Angelo.
So, Cindy, let's get started by telling me a little bit about your own spiritual religious background.
Sure. My dad was an atheist. His parents were Protestant, so my family background is Protestant, kind of culturally, I guess you could say. My mom had a kind of polytheistic, agnostic. She kind of worshipped stones and feathers and things. She just had a sense of the sacred, and a lot of her friends were Buddhists. I mean, I'm describing her form of spirituality, and I realize that sounds strange, but I actually think she had just an innate sense of the sacred, but no real theology to go with it. I had a nana, or I guess you could say a governess growing up, who was Irish Catholic, and she baptized me secretly when I was little. So,
Really?
Oh, yeah. She was a huge influence of mine. I adored her. And then most of my friends were Jewish, both in high school and also in college and before. And a lot of my parents' friends were. So I kind of feel partly culturally Jewish. So it was a bit of a polyglot situation.
So I think it'd be fair to say, Cindy, as I know you, that you've come from a fairly privileged background. And at the same time, you seem to be drawn into conversations about diversity. What accounts for that?
Well, I would say that, my dad worked in foreign policy. So diversity in terms of people from different countries was always part of my experience growing up. And I think, yes, I was in a privileged background, and I would actually partly it was invisible to me as a child and felt normal, and partly at times I would see it and it would seem abnormal and a little bit alarming. Like I remember looking around my house and saying, if we had to make these things with our own hands, we could never do it in a lifetime. How would we build these chairs and these pots and pans and these pretty antiques? And how would we do that? And who exchanged what for this? And also, my parents had 3 women who lived with us, who were a cook, the woman who took care of us children, and someone who did the cleaning. And I would think, why are they working for us and we're not working for them? And especially because my mom's temperament was sometimes less gentle than theirs was, I would think, well, that doesn't seem right. So I did grow up in a privileged background. And then when I was older, my dad, I had history teachers who had conspiracy theories about the kind of work my dad did. And that all had me trying to look and see how and why did things happen the way they did, and why did people see things so differently, and how could you unravel all of that?
Would it be fair to name the name of the organization your father was involved with?
Sure. So he was involved in the Council on Foreign Relations. He was the director of that for some time, most of the time when I was growing up, and later he was involved in the Trilateral Commission.
Yeah, I know that a lot of people have many conspiracy theories about the latter, the Trilateral Commission, that I remember glossing over when I was younger.
Yeah, I remember it too.
I know a little bit about your in addition to the fact that your father had this position, excuse me, I know a little bit about your family dynamics, and I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about that and say how that contributed to the mix, how that added to the person that Cindy is.
Well, I think what you're referring to is the fact that we had some mental illness in my family. I won't mention all of it because if my sisters listen to the podcast, I don't want them to be offended. But for example, my grandmother's favorite brother killed himself. My father's father had depression. My dad had very serious depressions, even though he had this kind of important job and was treated with a lot of respect by people, which I always did notice growing up. Sometimes he'd be hospitalized for depression, and it was very alarming and distressing to see his pain, and confusing also. I think that's what you're referring to.
Yeah, so that, to me, I guess it's a little bit of projection, but to me it modifies. You say you come from a privileged background. There are still issues that didn't make everything perfect and just la-di-da.
Well, no, I agree with you. I don't think that people, look at the Trump family. This I would get from my nana. But what I'm about to say, when I would say the Trump family, God bless them, is kind of which means you're about to say something not nice, actually. But what is to be envied in somebody who has a brother who killed himself and a father who was overbearing, and all of his family dynamics are very painful if you look at it. So I'm not trying to excuse his behavior, but what I'm saying is the comfort of having a big house and a lot of money is extreme compared to the discomfort of poverty and suffering. But there can be plenty of negative stuff even in those contexts.
Well, I personally have always believed suffering is suffering, pain is pain, and it doesn't matter how much money you have or how little you have. That's just how I look at it.
Well, I agree. And I think I was very aware of that as a child. And actually, I think if I were to say who are my role models growing up, it was a combination of my dad for his kindness and also my nana, the woman who, took care of me, who really didn't have physical wealth. She was an orphan and so on, but she had an extraordinary spirit, and she was clearly an amazing person. And I thought I wanted to be like her when I grew up, and I wanted to be like my dad. And in my mind, I would do some kind of work that was similar to both of them, which is, funny because their work was quite different. But they also had a lot of respect for each other, so that was nice.
Now, I know this is a kind of a question that asks you to boil things down to a single time in your life, which might not be possible. But I'm wondering, what happened in your life, Cindy, to make spiritual practice such an integral part of your journey?
Well, I think that I was looking to, I was always very interested in what made people happy and what made people mentally healthy and what made communities kind to each other, right? Because of the big conundrums that I saw, which was my dad wasn't the only person in my family who had mental illness, but since he was actually not shy to talk about it. He wrote a paper about it. I don't think other people wanted him to share it, but I think if he felt permitted, he would have shared it. So my dad, why do some people suffer like this? How can people find peace and happiness inside themselves? And how can they find wisdom? Because clearly the world, these very, very smart people, my dad and his friends would talk about how do we save the world, and looking at foreign policy and all of the horrible things that were happening, it didn't seem like intelligence was going to solve those problems. So I thought if I could find somebody who had wisdom, I could maybe learn from them.
And I'm sure there are parts that I may be skipping here, but I know that you got deeply involved in Indian spirituality. What was the attraction? Was there something about India, and particularly Hinduism, that attracted you?
Actually, no. I was interested in psychology, and then I realized that meditation, a lot of my mom's friends were Buddhist meditators and even wrote books on that. And I thought, okay, if you can quiet your mind and see your mind, you can become a better psychologist, basically. So I started studying that. And then I went and spent time with my teacher, my Indian teacher, who became my teacher, basically thinking he was just an expert meditator, not realizing that I was getting a lot more than I bargained for. And the reason that I stayed with him is that, I would tell people I happened to meet, the first saint I happened to meet was from an Indian tradition. If I'd met a saint from another tradition, I would have been in that tradition. But he had a power that I actually sat with him and had very profound spiritual experiences that were frightening because they were so not inside my worldview, but very beautiful. And I realized that there was a form of power, of blessing, that was part of human capability that I didn't know about, and that he had that. And I stayed with him to learn more about that.
Can you share one or two experiences that you talked about? You had some experiences that were sort of outside of your realm of familiarity. I wonder if you could share one or two.
Well, I think the first one, I was sitting in I had booked to spend 3 days in his retreat. I wasn't intending to learn a new form of spirituality, and I was a bit taken aback by all of the incense and pictures and what I would have thought of as paraphernalia attached to it. But I was sitting with him on the third night before I was going to leave, and I just had a shift in consciousness where I was actually looking at the photograph of his teacher, and it came alive, and many different expressions played across its face, and it just emanated energy. And I looked out and at this vast room full of people, and everybody was emanating light, and it had a quality of love in it that was very profound, and also somewhat electrifying. I mean, it would sort of move through my body physically, and I thought, what the hell is that? But they actually spoke about it. They said, this is a Shaktipat Guru. This is a teacher who will awaken your spiritual energy. Once it's active in you, it'll start opening up experiences. And after that, if I read like the Gnostic Gospels, any kind of mystical spirituality, it would seem like it made sense to me, whereas before it would feel very opaque. It would be, oh, they're describing this experience. So that was the first time.
Now, how did you get involved in Siddha Yoga?
Well, that's this teacher. That was
okay. I didn't know.
Yeah. That was the kind of yoga he taught. And then after that, I've had other teachers from other traditions as well, but he's my root teacher.
Well, I know that you've had a few spiritual teachers in your life. Maybe talk a little bit about some of the traditions they represent. How are they similar and different in demonstrating their power or wisdom?
Well, I've had spiritual teachers who were Hindu, who were Tibetan Buddhist, who were Lakota Native American, who were Quechua Indian from Peru, and one teacher who was from an Eastern European Jewish gypsy background and lineage. And I think what they had in common was they all had this, what I'm calling a power of blessing. In all cases, if I just sat with them and tried to feel the quality of their presence, I would feel an opening in my heart, an opening in my awareness. And I could understand their words through an experience that was meeting their words. In other words, what they were saying was being demonstrated by the experience that I was feeling inside as I listened to the words. And so to me, if that's present, then I trust that teacher. And I felt very relieved to feel that this is just available to people in many different traditions. It's a matter of going deep enough to find it. And then your presence, if you cultivate that, will influence other people in ways that will make them feel kind of peace inside or affection inside or these other qualities, a broader perspective perhaps. So,
well, I mean, Native American and Indian and I forget some of the Eastern European, these are very different traditions.
They are.
Can you maybe say a little bit about how they contrasted?
Sure. I would say, actually, so the contrast is sometimes on the surface. So, for example, I would have said that my Hindu teacher and teaching, well, what it opened in me was energetically my connection to kind of transcendent space. And my Lakota and Quechua teachers, or from indigenous Native American traditions, opened my reverence for the earth and trees and that kind of thing. But I actually think that reverence for the earth and trees is in the Hindu tradition, and that transcendent dimension is in the Lakota and Quechua tradition. So they show the same, they paint with the same colors, but they paint different pictures, but it's still the same primary colors. And one of the things I really appreciated about my teacher, who is Jewish Gypsy, was that he focused on sort of social justice and the real suffering of the cultural, genocide, the harm of cultural genocide, and so that you have to care about those things, and you have to, you can't just. None of the teachers I had were internal in their work, actually, because they were all trying to create a culture, and they all created communities that had an intention of sharing with the larger world. But he was most intent about the need to go to where suffering and unfairness is, and actually take responsibility for it. And I very much appreciated that in his teaching. So they all had particular flavors that they brought forward.
That's interesting what you said. The notion of being compassionate to the downtrodden, or whatever word we want to use. I mean, some people, it's just like, I'm just going to take you to the bliss. They don't even get involved in outreach, let's say. It seems that there's sort of different ways of approaching that.
I think that's really true. My teacher who came to America, we did some charity work, especially in India, but it really wasn't where his focus was. But his teacher opened many hospitals and did, poverty relief work in schools, and was very, very focused on that. So sometimes I think in the West, we think that some of the Eastern traditions don't have that, mainly because the teachers who came here were trying to cure our poverty, which is not primarily material. But in their own context, they do focus more on the on that kind of suffering as well.
I'm going to preface this a little bit, Cindy, by talking about a little bit of my experience, which is when I was much younger, I would go around to different spiritual groups and had a chance to observe a fair amount of spiritual teachers. And some of the individuals I would meet in my journey, it's like they were so narrow-minded in terms of their allegiance to a particular path that it was difficult to have a conversation with them unless I was going to use their vocabulary, let's say, or kind of have total alignment to the thing that they were following. So I'm wondering, so that's my experience, and I'm wondering if you think there's any downside to allegiance to a particular spiritual teacher.
I absolutely think there can be. So I'd like to comment on the upside as well as the downside, if I could.
Sure.
Because what my original teacher, whose name was Swami Muktananda, something that he said is, which I think is a typical Hindu teaching story, is you can go anywhere and dig to find a well, or anywhere where there is water, you can dig and find a well. But you're wasting your time if you dig 10 wells 2 feet deep instead of digging one well 20 feet deep. And what he was talking about is there can be many helpful traditions, practices, teachers, but you lose some depth if you're wandering a lot, basically. So I think that for me, working with one teacher or one tradition really intensely can bring a depth to your practice. I think the danger of, absolutely, it's very dangerous also because it's very powerful, intense commitment. And the dangers can have to do with both, do you find a teacher who in some way you can trust, A, and B, how are you as a student? And I think that the danger is trying to follow a teacher, think he'll provide safety for you or a set of instructions, external instructions, and have a kind of child-parent relationship rather than working with the teacher to cultivate an inner unfolding. And the way I sometimes think of it is, if I see that there are times when there are teachers who stand between the student and the light, it's like they say, I know, I'm connected to the light, you follow me, rather than helping the student connect to finding the light inside themselves and being able to share it through how they live their life to the best of their ability. I don't know if that answers.
No, that's very fair. It seems you seem to pinpoint the nature of the ego of the teacher.
The ego of the teacher, but also the ego of the student. And not only the ego of the student, but the childish hopes of the student. So usually if you're a student and if what you really want is something other than learning, if you want something other than spiritual development, like if you want safety and comfort and all of those things, very often you don't find safety and comfort if you're really on the spiritual path, because it's hard to explain, but it's not a safe and a comfortable journey, I don't think. And so if you seek that and you go to a teacher who offers that in exchange for your willingness to go to sleep and serve him and feel superior, then it's a bargain that you've made, which is not a positive bargain. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm not saying that, I think that I made mistakes, and I think everybody makes mistakes as a student. And I think that it's hard not to make mistakes also as a teacher. So I think that we have to grant ourselves that. But I also think sometimes you have to make mistakes to learn. And then if you are willing to if you know what you're looking for and you're not looking for safety and comfort, then I think you can find your way through those mistakes to find something that helps you feel like you're really growing.
Now, I'm going to shift in a minute and ask you questions about the Diversity and Spirituality Network. But before we get to that, I want to ask you this kind of broad question. Mm-hmm. What does all the things that we're talking about have to do with diversity in your mind?
Well, I think it's interesting, Angelo, because it's a kind of peculiar aspect of my life when I think about it, that in many ways I'm in a similar community to the one I grew up with. I mean, I live in a neighborhood that's mostly white. Most of my friends are white. Most of them are American, and so on. But almost the great majority of my teachers have been from other countries and other cultures and traditions. And so I think for me, spirituality has been a way that I've opened my mind to diversity of what's a truly, genuinely different way to experience life and the purpose of life and how to engage it, so that I don't fall asleep to my assumptions and my context. And so spirituality has been one of my paths for exploring diversity, to get out of some narrow constraints of my own mind and acculturation, I would say. And it's been really helpful for me with that. And then on the other hand, if people have different spiritual traditions and they don't respect each other, either for their spiritual tradition or for the culture they come from or the background they come from, then we can be projecting our own fears onto each other and creating emotional violence and other kinds of violence in relation to each other. So that's how they're connected for me.
Okay. So I know that you were a member, as was I, of the original planning circle of the Diversity and Spirituality Network, approximately 96 to 99, I think, something like that. I was wondering, big question, what was that experience like for you, and what did you learn from it?
Well, I absolutely loved it. It did give me a feeling of having the breadth of connecting with people, not just in my spiritual life, but in my sort of work life. I mean, I do facilitation and consulting and stuff for a living, and I just am aware there's so many parts of each human being that we don't share in the workplace, but that if we become comfortable with them inside ourselves and between ourselves, then for me, I feel more relaxed and whole, and I feel more connected to the people around me. And it did that for me. And then I would also say that I learned from the people in the network. For example, you, Angelo, your commitment to dialogue and your deep commitment to experience. I would say one of the things that is such a hallmark for me of what you bring is you don't want things to be conceptual. You want them to be experience-based. And then within that, there's a perfect honoring of each person for the experience that they have. So there's a lack of hierarchy and a openness to experience, which I think is very alive and very beautiful. And it's inspiring to me how you live that relationally, not just through your internal spiritual practices. So I found that very compelling and beautiful, and I appreciated those opportunities to explore with other folks in the context that you did so much to create.
Well, thank you for the compliment. I don't want to let that go without thanking you. And I think that you're a part of the thing that we're creating going forward. And I also know that we have somewhat, I'll just call them different perspectives as to what the network could be. But let me ask you, what is your perspective? What's your vision for the Diversity and Spirituality Network in the year 2017 going forward?
Well, the thing that is very stark to me right now is that I feel we need empathy and we need respect between people who have really deeply different orientations. And I think the more we are honest about the difference we have, the more often we surprisingly find the similarities. I just saw, Angelo, a movie on the plane on the way back to California, which was Yo-Yo Ma and the Silk Road Ensemble. And he's brought musicians from China, from Turkey, from Syria, from Spain, from the United States, from all over the world. And they are bringing the indigenous music traditions from their countries and learning from each other and creating something that's a shared musical language. And so there's both sides of that touched me. One side is many of them are actually preserving the traditions that are getting lost, like a Catalan woman preserving the bagpipes and a Chinese woman preserving the puppet shows. So I really honor the differences. And at the same time, they're very much honoring that we can learn from each other and have a common language that includes our differences. So it's a bit of a paradoxical movement of honoring the difference and even keeping it so that we have, for me, having a diversity of culture is a little bit like having diversity of seeds. If you have a monoculture of crops, it can be destroyed, or people can get sick because they don't get balanced nutrients. So I love to keep alive the different unique expressions of wisdom that come from different backgrounds. Now, I should say one other thing, which is that I think there's a political aspect too because certain people and certain backgrounds are not respected, respecting those is more crucial. It's a reparation of harm done. And I think that's very important. So to share and to repair the lack of respect that has been offered to certain individuals, traditions, points of view, background, I think it is a cultural healing for me as well.
Well,
how do you think we see that differently?
I don't know if we see it differently so much. One of the things for me that has become increasingly important for me, which is important for you in other contexts, is just expanding my own spirituality and helping others do the same, and to do that in a way that does not involve joining any particular group or hierarchical structure.
Yeah.
So, so there's a thing about bringing people together who are different and at the same time live within the context of believing that we're all part of this one thing. And there's also creating the opportunity for individuals to grow.
Right.
So to me, that's something new that I want to promote or be part of. And, it's not totally up to me. It's up to all of us that are involved in it. And I'm open to seeing what happens.
Well, I share with you the interest in creating a context where people can grow, very much so. And if I were to say in the example of the Yo-Yo Ma ensemble, I would say partly brought it up because my sense is when I'm with you is that you are focused on creating a common musical language by learning from everyone who's present so that the orchestra can actually play something together. And I really love that. And I think that where we sometimes have been a little different is that I also like that people are preserving their different languages inside of that as well to the extent that they want. But I join with you totally on seeing this as a chance to grow together.
Well, we've got a lot of adventures together to moving forward, Cindy, and so I want to thank you for participating in the podcast. And
thank you so much, Angelo. Look forward to seeing you soon.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my interview with my dear friend and colleague, Cindy Franklin, the co-founder of the Diversity and Spirituality Network. If you'd like to hear more about some of the founders of the network, you can go to our podcast page on divespirit.com. There's an interview that Cindy did with me, which is called About Us, a Foundation Story, and one in which I did with Rene Molenkamp called Spirituality is the River. And I hope one day to get the fourth founder, Dr. Zachary Gabriel Green, to consent to a podcast. In any event, I hope to see you next week. We've got a very entertaining interview with Siobhan Chandler, one of the foremost scholars of spiritual but not religious. She owns that website and has written quite extensively about it. See you next week.
What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is diversity? What is spirituality?